He is a man defined by his refusals. She is a woman who has run out of choices. Gideon Ashford Norwood, the 7th Duke of Carrick, has spent 13 years turning his heart into a fortress. Haunted by a tragic accident and famous for rejecting the most eligible women in England, he believes he is a ruin, destined to destroy anyone he lets close. But Elowen Sterling is not a typical bride. Arriving at the rain-drenched Carrick Hall with nothing but a borrowed dress and 17 shillings, Elowen is there by royal command. The king has decreed they must marry within 7 days, or Gideon will lose the lands that protect hundreds of his tenants. Gideon intends to wait her out in silence. He expects her to be meek, grateful, and invisible. He doesn't expect a woman who corrects his Greek translations, challenges his architectural designs, and refuses to be quarantined in the East Wing. As the deadline looms, the friction between them sparks a fire neither anticipated. In a house of shadows and secrets, Elowen must decide if she is just a pawn in a royal game, and Gideon must choose between the safety of his guilt and the woman who is meticulously redesigning his world. 7 days to marry, 2 souls with nothing left to lose, 1 chance to turn a ruin into a home. The carriage wheel struck a rut in the drive, and Elowen's shoulder connected with the window frame hard enough to leave what would certainly become a bruise. She did not adjust her position. She had learned, in 3 years of being shuttled between relatives who tolerated her presence the way one tolerates a persistent draft, that complaining about discomfort only reminded people you were there to be uncomfortable. Through the water-streaked glass, Carrick Hall emerged from the grey afternoon like something that had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. 3 stories of pale stone, wings spreading east and west with the confidence of a house that had never doubted its right to exist. The windows, she counted them without meaning to, a habit from childhood, reflected nothing but pewter sky. No lights, not a single one. Elowen's fingers found the king's decree in her reticule, the paper soft now from handling. She did not need to read it again. The words had carved themselves into her memory the morning Lord Ashworth had summoned her to his study. He had delivered the news while examining his correspondence, his shoulders loosening with each sentence, his voice carrying the bright efficiency of a man setting down a burden he had never wanted to lift. By royal command, Miss Elowen Marguerite Sterling shall present herself to Gideon Ashford Norwood, 7th Duke of Carrick, for the purpose of marriage, such union to be solemnized no later than Monday next. 7 days. She had 7 days to convince a man who had turned away 4 women of impeccable breeding and considerable fortune, a man whose refusals had become their own category of society gossip, to choose her instead, a woman with a borrowed dress and 17 shillings to her name. The carriage shuddered to a halt. Elowen waited for the footman to open the door, then remembered there was no footman, only the hired driver, who had made clear through 3 hours of silence that his duties extended to transportation and nothing resembling courtesy. She opened the door herself and stepped into the downpour. The front entrance of Carrick Hall featured a portico, supported by 4 Ionic columns, beneath which a woman stood with the rigid posture of someone who had been waiting long enough to have counted the minutes. Grey dress, white cap, a chatelaine at her waist heavy with keys. The housekeeper then, not the Duke. Elowen's trunk landed in a puddle behind her. The driver was already climbing back to his seat. "Miss Sterling." The housekeeper's voice carried across the distance between them. Not a question. "I am Mrs. Pemberton. I have instructions to show you to your rooms." Instructions. Not a welcome. Instructions as one might leave for the delivery of furniture. Elowen walked toward the portico, her half-boots finding every hollow the drive had to offer. The hem of her dress, her 3rd best, which was also her only remaining dress suitable for arriving at a duke's estate, grew heavy with water. She kept her pace measured. She would not give anyone at Carrick Hall the satisfaction of watching her scurry like a tradesman caught in bad weather. "The Duke," she said when she reached the shelter of the portico, "is indisposed." Mrs. Pemberton's expression did not change. "His Grace is occupied with estate business." "I see." Elowen looked past the housekeeper to the entrance hall visible through the open door. Marble floors, a staircase that curved upward into shadow, and not a single candle lit against the gloom. Occupied, on the afternoon his commanded bride arrives. How fortunate that estate business keeps such convenient hours. Something flickered in the housekeeper's eyes, a slight widening quickly controlled. Her gaze moved over Elowen's sodden dress, her dripping hair, her lifted chin, and something in her posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "If you'll follow me, Miss Sterling." The interior of Carriwick Hall smelled of beeswax and cold stone, the scent of a house that had been polished and preserved but rarely warmed with occupation. Elowen's wet boots left dark prints on the marble as she followed Mrs. Pemberton past closed doors and unlit sconces, up the curving staircase, down a corridor lined with portraits of Norwood ancestors, who all seemed to share the same unforgiving jaw. Her rooms were in the east wing, a sitting room, a bedchamber, a dressing room she would not need because she had no lady's maid and nothing worth displaying. The furniture was elegant and impersonal, arranged with the precision of spaces designed to be admired rather than inhabited. "Dinner is served at 8, Mrs. Pemberton said from the doorway. "In your rooms. His Grace dines privately." "Of course he does." "And breakfast," Elowen asked, "will be brought to you at 9. "I see." She turned from the glass panes, where she had been watching the storm sheet across surfaces that needed cleaning. "Mrs. Pemberton, where does the Duke take his breakfast?" The housekeeper's hands stilled on her chatelaine. A breath passed before she answered. "His Grace takes breakfast in his study, at 7. "Thank you. That will be all." She waited until the door closed before allowing herself to sit on the edge of the bed. The mattress was firm, the linens crisp, the pillows plump with down. Everything a guest could want, provided the guest understood she was not wanted. Elowen caught her reflection in the darkened glass across the room, copper hair escaping its pins after hours in the carriage, the face of a woman who had arrived at her last chance and found it barred against her. She stood and moved to the dressing room, where her single trunk had been deposited with notable efficiency. The dress she wore was beyond saving, the hem blackened, the fabric clinging to her skin. She would have to manage the buttons herself, as she had managed them this morning at the Ashworths, standing before her borrowed mirror and contorting her arms until her shoulders ached. 3 years without a lady's maid had made her resourceful, if not graceful. The trunk yielded her second-best dress, sage green, slightly outdated in cut but dry. She laid it across the bed for tomorrow and changed into her nightclothes with the methodical movements of a woman conserving her strength. The third-best dress she draped over the fire screen near the cold hearth, hoping it might be salvageable by morning. The Duke of Carriwick thought he could wait her out. He thought if he refused to see her, refused to acknowledge her, she would understand her position and accept it with appropriate meekness. He did not know her. He did not know that she had spent 3 years being overlooked in drawing rooms, dismissed at dinner tables, reminded daily that she existed on sufferance and should be grateful for it. He did not know that she had perfected the art of taking up space precisely because everyone expected her to vanish. She would be in his study at 7. She would take breakfast at his table in his chair if necessary, and she would not leave until he looked at her, until he understood that Elowen Sterling did not accept refusal from men who could not be bothered to deliver it themselves. The storm continued against the glass, relentless and indifferent, and somewhere in this vast unlit house, a duke was hiding from a woman with no dowry and nothing left to lose. She intended to make the hiding very, very difficult. She rose at 6:30. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving the bedchamber cold enough that her breath showed faint in the grey morning light. Elowen dressed quickly, fingers clumsy on buttons that a maid would have managed in half the time, the same buttons she had wrestled with yesterday, damp and shivering after hanging her sodden third-best dress over the chair to dry. She chose the dove-grey wool today, practical, warm, the dress of a woman who intended to be taken seriously. She pinned her hair in the same arrangement she had worn for her arrival, using the small glass above the washstand and tilting her head to confirm that nothing had escaped. Good enough. She was not trying to be beautiful. She was trying to be unavoidable. The corridor stretched silent in both directions, portraits watching from their frames, with expressions that suggested they had been dead long enough to find the living disappointing. Elowen counted doors as she walked. Mrs. Pemberton had mentioned the study only in passing. His Grace takes breakfast there at 7, miss, with the clear implication that this information was meant to help Elowen avoid it. She found the study on her 3rd attempt, after opening a music room and a small parlour that smelled of disuse and dried lavender. The 4th door was different, Warm light showed beneath it. The scent of coffee and toast drifted through the gap. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute she had grown accustomed to at her cousin's table. Her stomach tightened at the smell. 3 years since she had tasted proper coffee. Alawan knocked once, did not wait for an answer, and walked in. He was standing by the window. She had expected him seated, perhaps surprised over a newspaper, caught at a disadvantage. Instead, he stood with his back to the room, one hand braced against the window frame, watching the weather that had apparently decided to make a permanent residence of Karowick. The morning light caught the breadth of his shoulders, beneath a coat of dark blue superfine, perfectly cut, carelessly worn, as though he had dressed without consulting a mirror either. He turned. The eyes she had heard described as cold were, she decided instantly, misnamed. They were not cold, they were watchful. A winter sky before snowfall, yes, but the kind that was measuring distances, assessing whether shelter could be reached in time. Right now they were assessing her. Miss Sterling. His voice matched the descriptions she had collected, low, unhurried. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. I was told you take breakfast in your rooms at 9. I was told you take yours here at 7. She moved further into the room, positioning herself between him and the exit. A tactical decision. I thought we might save Mrs. Pemberton the trouble of serving 2 separate meals. Mrs. Pemberton manages an estate of 47 rooms. I doubt 2 breakfast trays strain her capabilities. Then I am saving myself the trouble of eating alone. She sat in the chair across from his desk, uninvited, unwelcome, immovable. Again. A muscle shifted in his jaw. His hand dropped from the window frame and closed at his side. He remained standing, which meant he was looking down at her, which was presumably the point. You were not expected until Thursday, he said. I was not expected at all, she corrected. The king's expectations and yours appear to diverge. The king's expectations are none of your concern. On the contrary. She folded her hands in her lap, stilling the tremor that wanted to betray her. His expectations are the only reason I am here. Unless you believe I crossed 3 counties in a hired coach for the pleasure of your company. His mouth flattened, not quite a smile, closer to its opposite. You are remarkably direct, Miss Sterling. I have found that directness saves time. We have, she paused, counting, 6 days. I would prefer not to waste them on pleasantries neither of us means. He moved then, finally, crossing to the desk and taking the seat behind it with the deliberate motion of a man reclaiming territory. The desk itself was covered in papers, ledgers, what looked like architectural drawings weighted down with inkwells and small stones. She noted it all without appearing to look. A habit by now, reading rooms before they could be explained away. 6 days, he repeated. And what, precisely, do you imagine will occur in 6 days? That depends entirely on you. Does it? I'm already here. I have already agreed. She met his gaze and held it, refusing the instinct that suggested looking away. You are the obstacle. Your Grace. The title landed like a small blade, precise, deliberate. His fingers stilled on the papers before him. You read Greek. The change of subject was so abrupt that she blinked. What? He gestured toward the bookshelf behind her. You looked at the Thucydides when you entered. Not the novels, not the poetry, the Thucydides. She had looked. She had not realized he'd noticed. My father believed in comprehensive education. Your father is dead. Yes, the word came out steady. She made certain of it. He also believed in debt, which is why I am here instead of in my own home, though I imagine you already know that. He said nothing. His gaze dropped to the papers on his desk. Confirmation enough. A servant entered with fresh coffee, moved with quiet efficiency around the tension in the room, and departed without meeting anyone's eye. The door closed with a soft click. The clock on the mantelpiece marked the seconds. Neither of them reached for the coffee. You will take your meals in your rooms, he said finally. You will confine yourself to the east wing before noon and the gardens after. No. His cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down again with excessive care. I beg your pardon? I said no. I am not a fever to be quarantined. She rose, smoothing her skirts, and allowed herself the first small smile of the morning. I will take breakfast here tomorrow. and the day after, until you stop pretending I can be avoided into non-existence." She walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. "The Thucydides, by the way," she said, not turning around. "Your copy has an error in the marginalia. Book 2, Chapter 43. Someone translated Kalon as noble, when the context clearly supports beautiful." She left before he could answer. Behind her, the silence had a texture she recognized. It was the quality of a man setting down assumptions he had not known he was carrying. "Good," she thought, and went to find out whether the library was as impressive as the study suggested. By 10 o'clock they had argued twice more. The first disagreement concerned the morning room, specifically whether Elowen was permitted to occupy it. She had found it by following the southern corridor until the light changed quality, shifting from the dim grey of interior hallways to something brighter, almost warm despite the clouds pressing against the glass. The room faced the gardens, such as they were in late autumn. Skeletal hedges, gravel paths dark with moisture, a stone fountain that had been drained for winter. She had settled into a chair by the largest pane and opened the book she had selected from the library, a treatise on estate management that she suspected the Duke had never expected anyone to read. He found her 20 minutes later. "This room is not in the East Wing." Elowen turned a page. "I am aware." "Miss Sterling, the East Wing receives no morning light whatsoever. I checked." She glanced up briefly before returning to her book. "If you wish to confine me somewhere tolerable, you should have been more specific in your geography." He stood in the doorway for a long moment. She could feel the weight of his attention on her shoulders, on the back of her neck, on the page she was pretending to read. The treatise discussed crop rotation. She could not have summarized a single sentence. "That book," he said finally, "is 30 years out of date. I noticed. Your library's agricultural section could use attention. I will be certain to add it to the list of improvements. Below the tenant cottages, I hope." His silence changed quality. She looked up again and something had shifted in his expression, a crack in the careful blankness, quickly sealed. "You saw the drawings?" "I saw drawings. I did not realize they were secret." "They are not secret. They are—" He stopped, started again. "They are not relevant to your presence here. Everything about this estate is relevant to my presence here." She closed the book, marking her place with one finger. "Or do you imagine I agreed to marry into a situation I had not researched?" The word marry landed between them like a stone dropped into still water. She watched the ripples cross his face, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his shoulders drew back half an inch. "You have not agreed to anything," he said. "The king commanded. That is not agreement." "I could have refused." "Could you?" The question was quieter than the ones before it. She found she did not have an immediate answer. "I chose to come," she said finally. "I chose to stay. If you cannot see the difference between command and choice, that is your limitation, not mine." She returned to her book. After a moment, she heard his footsteps retreat down the corridor. The second argument occurred at 11, when she discovered the music room had a pianoforte and sat down to play. She was not accomplished. Her father's finances had permitted lessons only until she was 14, and the years since had offered few opportunities for practice. But she remembered enough to pick out a simple melody, something she had learned before everything changed. The keys were slightly out of tune. The sound filled the empty room like water filling a vessel, finding all the spaces that had gone too long in silence. She did not hear him enter. "That instrument has not been played in 4 years." Her hands stilled on the keys. She turned. He was standing just inside the door, his expression unreadable. But something in the way he held himself, spine rigid, shoulders braced, suggested the pianoforte held weight she had not anticipated. "I apologize," she said carefully. "I did not realize it was—" "It is not forbidden." The words came clipped, precise. "Play what you wish." He left before she could respond. She sat for a long moment, her hands resting on keys that had not been touched in 4 years. 4 years. His brother had died 4 years ago. She had gathered that much from the whispers, the fragments of gossip that attached themselves to the Duke's name like barnacles to a hull. She played nothing else that morning. The third argument was her fault. She found him in the library at 4:30, after an afternoon spent exploring the sections of the house he had not specifically forbidden. The library was vast, 2 stories of shelves connected by a narrow spiral stair, a fireplace large enough to stand in, and windows that would have offered extraordinary light on any day less determined to be grey. He was seated at a table near the fire, papers spread before him, a pen in his hand. The architectural drawings again. She recognized the careful lines, the notations in a hand that was precise without being elegant. "You are rebuilding the entire West Row," she said. His pen stopped moving. He did not look up. "Miss Sterling, I believe we established that the library is common ground." "We established nothing. You commanded. I disregarded. That is not establishment." She moved closer, looking at the drawings despite his obvious reluctance. "Stone foundations, proper chimneys. This will cost a fortune. The estate can bear it." "Can it?" She traced a finger along the edge of one plan, a cottage with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, a small parlour, more than most tenant families could dream of. "The leases you are trying to protect, they generate how much annual income?" His jaw tightened. "You have been thorough in your research." "I told you I do not agree to things I have not investigated." "And what have your investigations revealed?" She met his eyes, held them. "That you are not the villain the Ton believes you to be, that you have refused 4 perfectly suitable women for reasons no one can explain, that your brother died 4 years ago and you have not attended a social function since." She paused. "That the king has chosen me specifically, and I cannot determine why." Something flickered in his expression, there and gone like light through a closing door. "The king's reasons are his own. The king does nothing without reason. Neither do you." She gestured at the drawings. The storm arrived without ceremony, as if the sky had simply decided to collapse. Gallowin had been exploring the library's western reaches when the first crack of thunder shook the windows hard enough to rattle the brass fixtures. She had discovered, over 2 hours of systematic investigation, that Carriwick's library was less a room than a small country. 3 interconnected chambers lined floor to ceiling with volumes that smelled of leather and age and the faint sweetness of paper slowly returning to dust. She had also discovered, quite by accident, that she was trapped. The doors to the main corridor had been closed against the draft, and when she tried the handle, it refused to yield. Swollen wood, perhaps, or a lock she had not noticed engaging. Either way, the result was the same. She stood in a room the size of a small chapel, listening to water hammer against glass, with no immediate means of exit. This would not have troubled her unduly. She had weathered worse than an afternoon's forced reading, except for the voice that came from somewhere behind the section on estate management. "The door sticks in wet weather." Elowin's hand remained on the handle. She did not turn. "One must lift slightly while pulling," the Duke continued, his tone suggesting he was explaining something to a particularly slow child. "Though I would recommend against attempting the corridor at present. Mrs. Blackwood will have closed the connecting doors and the east passage floods." She turned then, because dignity demanded she face whatever came next standing. He emerged from between 2 shelving units, and the sight of him stuttered something in her chest that she chose not to examine. His coat had been discarded. She could see it draped over a chair near the windows, and his shirt sleeves were rolled to the elbow in a manner that would have scandalized her aunt into an early grave. Ink stained his right hand. A pencil was tucked behind one ear, apparently forgotten. He looked, for the first time since her arrival, like a man rather than a fortress. "You work here," she said, because the observation seemed safer than the alternatives crowding her tongue. "I find the light adequate." He gestured toward the bank of windows, currently streaming with water that turned the glass into something molten and alive. Under normal circumstances, thunder rolled again, closer now, and Elowin felt the vibration travel through the floorboards and up into her bones. She released the door handle and stepped further into the room, unwilling to hover at the threshold like a nervous housemaid. "How long do these storms typically last?" "An hour. 3. The entirety of the afternoon." He moved back toward whatever had occupied him, and she found herself following without conscious decision, drawn by the same instinct that made her open books and peer around corners and ask questions she should have left unvoiced. Carriwick sits in a valley that channels weather from the coast. When it rains, it commits to the enterprise. The table beneath the windows was covered in papers, and Elowen stopped at its edge, close enough now to see what spread across its surface. Architectural drawings, dozens of them, layered and cross-referenced and annotated in a hand she recognized from his correspondence. Not the professional renderings of a hired draftsman, but working sketches, alive with corrections and measurements and small marginal notes that revealed a mind in active conversation with itself. She bent closer before she could stop herself, tracing the clean lines of what appeared to be a cottage. Then another, a whole row of them, repeated with variations that spoke of problem-solving rather than simple copying. "These are yours." It was not a question. The Duke's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. "They are. You designed these yourself." "I trained as an architect. Before." He did not specify before what, but the word carried weight, the particular gravity of a door closing on a previous life. The skill remained useful. Elowen straightened, but her attention refused to leave the drawings. The cottages were beautiful in the way that functional things could be beautiful, proportioned for living rather than looking, with careful attention to details that would never appear in a society column, window placement that would catch morning light, roof angles designed to shed water efficiently, chimneys positioned. "The flues face southwest," she said, frowning, "away from the prevailing winds." Silence. When she looked up, the Duke was watching her with an expression she could not pass, something between wariness and an unwilling interest. "You know which direction the winds blow. I grew up in the country, before my father's debts required us to relocate to London." She touched the edge of the nearest drawing, her fingertip brushing a measurement notation. "Traditional chimney placement creates a draft that pulls heat from the main room. When the wind comes from the northeast, these would stay warmer." "Yes?" The single syllable emerged slowly, as if he were not quite certain he wished to release it. "That was the intention." "Intention for what?" He did not answer immediately. Outside, lightning split the darkness, and for one frozen moment the room blazed white, every spine illuminated, every surface sharp with sudden clarity. In that light, she saw his face stripped of its usual careful control, the exhaustion beneath his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand had curled into a fist at his side. Then thunder crashed and the library returned to its grey half-light, and his expression sealed itself away. "The Northern Tenant Holdings," he said finally. 14 families in structures that should have been replaced 2 decades ago. My father preferred to invest in improvements visible from the main house. A pause. "I have different priorities." Elowen looked at the drawings again, really looked this time. Not just at their technical competence, but at what they revealed, the repeated iterations, each one refined from the last. The material calculations in the margins, crossed out and recalculated, searching for efficiency without sacrificing quality. The small notation in the corner of one sheet that read simply, "Must be warm enough." "How long have you been working on these?" 3 years. "And in 3 years, you haven't built them?" His expression flickered, there and gone, like the lightning that still played at the edges of the windows. "Building requires resources. Resources require the estate leases to remain intact." The words landed in Elowen's chest with the weight of understanding. She turned fully to face him, her back to the table now, the drawings spread behind her like evidence. "That's why the King's decree matters, not just for your pride or your resistance to marriage. If you lose those leases, 200 tenant families lose their homes." His voice had dropped lower, rougher at the edges. "The Northern Holdings are on Crown land. The preferential renewal has been in my family for 6 generations, but it requires the Crown's continued goodwill. Goodwill that His Majesty has made contingent on my cooperation with his matchmaking. And your cooperation requires marrying me. My cooperation requires marriage. You are simply the woman the King selected." He met her gaze, and something in his expression had shifted, not softer precisely but more present, as if he were allowing her to see more than he intended. "I do not know why. Whatever connection exists between your family and the Crown's interest in this matter remains unclear to me." Elowen's heart was doing something unsteady beneath her ribs. She pressed her palm flat against the table behind her, grounding herself against the solid wood. "I don't know either," she admitted. "My father was a viscount, but a minor one, no influence, no particular connection to the crown. When the decree arrived, I assumed there had been some mistake." "And when you learned there had not been?" "I packed my trunk." She lifted her chin, meeting his assessment without flinching. "I have become proficient at making quick decisions when alternatives are scarce." The storm raged against the windows, filling the silence between them with water and wind. The Duke stood very still, not frozen but gathered, like a man deciding whether to step forward or retreat. "You understand what the king has done?" "Not a question. He has taken the one thing I cannot afford to lose and made it contingent on surrendering the one thing I had resolved never to risk. A wife. Another person close enough to—" He stopped. His jaw worked, the muscles visible beneath his skin. "Close enough to lose," Eloin completed silently. "Close enough to hurt, close enough to destroy the way his brother was destroyed, on a dark road 17 miles from anywhere." She had heard the rumors, everyone had, the whispers about the 7th Duke's frozen demeanor, the 4 refused proposals, the brother who had died young and violently and in circumstances that no one discussed in detail. "You think you ruin things," she said quietly. "People. You think if you let them close, you'll ruin them too." His face went carefully blank, so carefully that she knew she had struck bone. "What I think," he said, "is not your concern. It is if you intend to make a decision about both our futures based on it." "I intend to make a decision based on what I owe to the 200 families whose lives depend on those leases." His voice had gone quiet, the dangerous quiet she was beginning to recognize as something worse than shouting. "Not what I owe to myself, and certainly not what I owe to a woman I met 3 days ago." Eloin pushed off from the table, closing the distance between them until she stood near enough to see the pulse jumping in his throat, near enough to smell ink and paper and something underneath, cedar perhaps, or the particular scent of a man who had been working for hours and forgotten to notice. "Then let me make something clear," she said. "I am not here because I imagined you would be kind to me. I am not here because I believe this arrangement will make either of us happy. I am here because I have a small trunk containing everything I own, 3 years of experience being tolerated by relatives who counted the days until they could pass me elsewhere, and exactly 1 chance to build something that cannot be taken away." She held his gaze, and if her hands trembled, she clasped them behind her back where he could not see. "Your tenants need those leases. I need a home that is actually mine. The king has created a situation where both of those needs can be met through the same action." She drew a breath. "I am not asking you to want this marriage. I am asking you to stop pretending that refusing it would be noble rather than simply expensive. For both of us." The words hung between them, sharp-edged and irretrievable. The Duke's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes shifted, a recalculation perhaps, or the beginning of one. "You argue," he said slowly, "as if you expect me to listen." "I argue because silence has never served me." She smiled, and if it carried edges, she did not soften them. "My aunt told me that women who offer opinions without being asked are unlikely to receive proposals. The irony of my current situation has not escaped me." For a long moment, he simply looked at her. The storm battered the windows. The candlelight, when had the candles been lit, threw shadows that jumped and shifted across the book-lined walls. Then, very quietly, he laughed. It was not a happy sound, more rust than humor, as if the mechanism for laughter had gone unused so long it had forgotten its purpose. But it was real, the most genuine thing she had heard from him since her arrival. "You are not what I expected," he said. "Good." She stepped back, giving them both room to breathe. "I would hate to be predictable." She turned and walked toward the door, remembering this time to lift slightly while pulling, and felt the handle yield beneath her grip. The corridor beyond was dark, but no longer impassable. She did not look back, but she heard him speak, so softly she might have imagined it. "No, you are certainly not that." Eloin carried the words with her through the flooded passages and up the servants' stair, pressing them against her chest like something stolen, like something earned. Behind her, in the library that smelled of old paper and fresh ink, the Duke returned to his drawings of cottages that did not yet exist. And if he traced the line of a roof with more care than before, there was no one present to notice. The carriage arrived at 4:30. Helawen heard it from the small parlour, where she had been holding a book for the better part of an hour, her eyes travelling the same paragraph repeatedly, while her thoughts drifted to architectural drawings and forearms bared to the elbow. The distraction annoyed her enough that the distant clatter of wheels on gravel came as a relief. From the window, she watched a black lacquered carriage with gilt trim roll to a stop before the portico. The horses were matched bays, coats gleaming like polished chestnuts, their breath fogging in the late afternoon chill. The footman who descended wore livery of deep burgundy, each brass button catching the weak sunlight. Old money, the kind that announced itself without speaking. A woman emerged, silver hair beneath a travelling bonnet of midnight blue, spine straight as a blade. She surveyed Carriwick Hall's facade with her chin lifted, her gloved hand resting on the carriage door for precisely 2 seconds before she released it and stepped forward. The measured pause of someone who had spent 60 years finding the world slightly insufficient. Mrs. Pemberton appeared in the parlour doorway, her hands clasped at her waist, her mouth pressed thin. "Lady Philippa Norwood has arrived, Miss Sterling. She is the Duke's aunt. I gathered. She will be staying for dinner." The housekeeper's gaze dropped to the carpet. "The Duke requests that you join them. 8 o'clock, the formal dining room." Elowen closed her book. "Requests." His word, miss. Of course it was. The formal dining room was designed to intimidate. 30 feet of polished mahogany stretched between walls, hung with ancestral portraits. Men with the Duke's jaw, women with his winter blue eyes, all of them staring down at anyone foolish enough to take a seat. Candelabras threw light that caught crystal and silver, fracturing into cold brilliance across the damask tablecloth. The smell of beeswax and hothouse lilies hung heavy, almost cloying. Elowen had dressed in her blue muslin, her best, her only remaining weapon, and pinned her hair with more care than usual. The final twist had required 3 attempts, her fingers refusing to cooperate, and she had stood before the mirror for a long moment afterward, breathing slowly, willing her hands to steady. She was early. She intended to be. Lady Philippa was earlier. The older woman sat at the table's centre, positioned as though the mahogany and silver had arranged themselves around her. Her gown was the grey of storm clouds, her jewels understated but genuine, a single strand of pearls, earrings that caught the candlelight with muted fire. Her eyes, that same ice blue as her nephew's, tracked Elowen's entrance the way a cat tracks the flutter of wings. "Miss Sterling." Not a greeting, a classification. "Lady Philippa." Elowen curtsied, rose, and took the seat across from her without waiting to be directed. The chair scraped against the floor, too loud in the cavernous room. "I understand you arrived this afternoon." "I arrived the moment I received word that my nephew was entertaining an unmarried woman without proper chaperonage." Lady Philippa's voice was cultured, precise, each syllable landing with the weight of absolute certainty. "The tongue talks, Miss Sterling. I am here to ensure it talks about something other than scandal." "How thoughtful." "It is not thoughtfulness, it is necessity." Lady Philippa lifted her wineglass, turned it slowly between her fingers, set it down without drinking. The crystal caught the light, scattering brief rainbows across the tablecloth. "You are Ashmore's daughter." The name landed like a stone dropped into still water. Elowen felt the ripples move through her, the familiar tightening in her chest, the heat threatening to climb her throat. She kept her spine straight. "I am." "I knew your father. We were introduced at the Hartwell ball in... Oh, it must have been 92. He was charming, handsome." Lady Philippa's lips curved, but warmth never reached her eyes. "Entirely without substance. He lost £4,000 to my late husband that same evening. I believe he paid perhaps a third of it before his creditors began their pursuit. The heat won." It crept up Elowen's neck, spreading beneath her jaw. She forced her voice to remain level. "I was not aware you were acquainted." "I make it my business to be acquainted with anyone who might affect my family." Your father affected a great many people, Miss Sterling. Dressmakers, merchants, minor lords foolish enough to extend him credit. A pause. Lady Philippa smoothed an invisible wrinkle from her sleeve. And now, apparently, the Norwood succession. Beneath the table, Elowen's hands found each other, her fingers laced tight, knuckles pressing against knuckles. The King's decree affects the Norwood succession, Lady Philippa. I merely arrived when summoned. Did you? It was not a question. How very passive. How very convenient that the Crown should choose a woman of no fortune, no connections, and a father whose debts were legendary enough to be discussed 3 counties away. The words were surgical, precise, designed to draw blood while leaving no visible wound. Elowen had heard variations of this speech for 3 years, from her cousin Edgar, who liked to mention her father's failures over breakfast, from his wife, who smiled while she did it, from servants who spoke just loudly enough in hallways, confident she would pretend not to hear. She had learned to absorb such cuts, to smile, to become small and grateful and easy to overlook. She was so very tired of being easy to overlook. My father, she said, her voice quiet but clear, made choices I cannot defend and left debts I cannot repay. I am aware of his failings, Lady Philippa. I have been made aware of them by every relative who has housed me since his death, usually at dinner, often in company. She unlaced her fingers, pressed her palms flat against her thighs, always with the unmistakable satisfaction of people who have never failed at anything, because they have never risked anything worth failing at. Lady Philippa's eyes narrowed. A muscle flickered near her jaw. I did not choose this decree, Elowen continued. I did not request it. I did not scheme for it. I woke 4 days ago in a house where I was tolerated, and I was informed that the king required me to marry a man I had never met. My alternatives were ruination or penury. She met Lady Philippa's gaze and held it. The candle flames danced in those ice-blue eyes, or perhaps that was her own vision wavering. So yes, I arrived when summoned, because the alternative was to cease existing in any way that mattered. And whatever my father was, Lady Philippa, I am not yet ready to disappear. Silence settled over the table like snowfall. The candelabras flickered. Somewhere deeper in the house, a clock struck the quarter hour, each chime hanging in the air. Lady Philippa opened her mouth. That is enough. The voice came from the doorway. Low, unhurried, cold enough to frost glass. Gideon stood at the threshold, dressed in black evening clothes that sharpened the angles of his face, the severity of his jaw. He did not move. He did not need to. His gaze was fixed on his aunt, with the focused stillness of something about to strike. Philippa. Just her name. A warning wrapped in 2 syllables. Gideon, I am simply... You will not speak to Miss Sterling about her father again. The older woman's chin lifted. I am attempting to protect you from a fortune hunter who... Again. The word dropped like a blade meeting wood. In this house, at this table, or anywhere within my hearing. Do you understand me? Lady Philippa's face went rigid. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her wineglass. For a long moment neither of them moved, aunt and nephew locked in some silent battle Elowen could sense, but not read. Gideon crossed to the head of the table. He remained standing, one hand resting on the back of his chair, his knuckles bloodless against the dark wood. Miss Sterling did not ask for this marriage. She was commanded to it, as was I. If you wish to dine here tonight, you will treat her as a guest of this house. He pulled out the chair. Sat. His spine never touched the back. If you cannot manage that, the carriage will be brought around within the hour. The silence stretched thin enough to snap. Elowen's pulse beat hard at the base of her throat. She watched Lady Philippa's face cycle through something, shock, perhaps, or reassessment, or simply the recalibration of a woman who had misjudged her position. Finally, Lady Philippa lifted her wineglass, drank, set it down with the careful precision of someone conceding a single battle while reserving judgment on the war. Well, she said, this is unexpected. Gideon did not respond. He did not look at Elowen, but his hand, she noticed, had not released the edge of the table. The tendons stood out beneath his skin, taut as bowstrings. And she understood. Without being told, that whatever had just happened, he had not planned it, had not expected it, had surprised himself as thoroughly as he had surprised everyone else in the room. The footman began to serve the soup. The spoons clinked against porcelain. Lady Philippa commented on the weather. And Elowen sat in the formal dining room of Carriwick Hall, wearing her only good dress, watching a man who had spent 13 years refusing to want anything defend her honor without once meeting her eyes. She did not know what it meant. She suspected he did not know either. Sleep refused her. Elduin had tried everything, counting backward from 500, reciting the kings of England in order, lying perfectly still until her limbs ached with the effort of motionlessness. Nothing worked. Lady Philippa's voice kept threading through her thoughts like smoke through lace, impossible to grasp, impossible to escape. Convenient, is it not? She pressed her palms against her closed lids until colours bloomed in the darkness. Her father's face surfaced unbidden, not as he had been at the end, diminished and apologetic, but as she remembered him from childhood, laughing, promising, always promising. "I shall make it right, Ellie. You'll see." He never had. At midnight, she abandoned the pretense of rest. Her wrapper was thin, meant for summer, kept because she could not afford another, but she pulled it on regardless and slipped into the corridor. The floorboards groaned beneath her bare feet. She paused, listening, but Carriwick Hall held its silence like a secret. The servant's stairs brought her to a side door she had noticed during her first morning's exploration. It opened onto a walled garden, and the night air struck her face like cold water, sharp enough to make her gasp. Frost silvered the hedges. A half-moon hung low, casting the world in shades of pewter and shadow. Her breath misted before her as she stepped onto the flagstone path, her bare feet protesting the ice-kissed stone. She should go back. This was foolish. A woman in her nightclothes wandering a garden she had no claim to, in a house where she remained on sufferance despite any royal decree. But the walls of her borrowed room had begun to feel like a coffin, and she needed air. She needed sky. She needed something that did not smell of beeswax and old portraits and judgments rendered before she had spoken a single word. The garden was larger than she had expected, divided into sections by low boxwood hedges. She followed the path without destination, letting her feet choose until she rounded a corner and stopped. He stood before a stone bench set into an alcove of yew, his back to her, his dark head bowed. No coat, no cravat, just shirt sleeves, pale in the moonlight, and the rigid line of his shoulders that she was beginning to recognize as something other than arrogance. She should leave. She had intruded on something private. That much was clear from the way he stood, from the quality of stillness that surrounded him like a held breath. Her foot shifted on the flagstones. He turned. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. His face was difficult to read in the half-light, but she caught the tension in his jaw, the way his hands hung loose at his sides, as though he had forgotten what to do with them. "You should be inside." His voice came rough, stripped of its usual careful modulation. "It's freezing." "So should you." A sound escaped him, not quite a laugh, not quite anything else. He looked away, back toward the bench, and she followed his gaze to the inscription carved into the stone beneath the seat. Edmund Ashford Norwood, 1789 to 1809, beloved. The name settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Edmund. She had heard the name once, whispered by a footman to a maid who had shushed him immediately. The younger brother. The accident. She did not ask. She did not offer sympathy or platitudes or any of the empty phrases people use to fill the space around grief. She simply stood, her bare feet aching against the frozen ground, and waited. He was 19. Gideon's voice came from somewhere far away, as though he was speaking to the bench rather than to her. Reckless. Convinced he was immortal, as boys that age so often are. A pause. I was 22, old enough to know better, young enough to think dares were still amusing. Elowen's breath caught. She pressed her lips together, holding the silence like something fragile. My horses, my challenge, my... He stopped. When he spoke again, the words came slower, as though each one cost him something. He bled to death on a road 17 miles from anywhere, and I could do nothing but hold him and watch. The garden seemed to contract around them, the frost-touched hedges and silver moonlight becoming very small, very close. She thought of all the things Lady Philippa had implied at dinner, that Elowen was grasping, opportunistic, trading on a convenient decree. She thought of her father's debts, her borrowed rooms, her borrowed dresses, her borrowed life. And she thought of this man, standing in a frozen garden at midnight, speaking to a stone bench because he had no one else to tell. "I was 14 when my mother died." The words left her before she could stop them. Fever. It took 3 days. My father sat by her bed and held her hand and swore he would take care of me, that I would want for nothing. She wrapped her arms around herself, the thin wrapper useless against the cold. Within a year he had gambled away my dowry. Within 3 he had lost the house. He died apologizing for the inconvenience, he said, as though I had been inconvenienced, rather than... She could not finish. Her throat had closed around the word, whatever it was. Gideon turned to look at her. In the moonlight his face had lost its careful blankness. Something raw showed through, something that matched the hollow ache beneath her ribs. "You are going to freeze," he said quietly. "Probably." He did not move toward her. He did not offer his coat or his arm or any gesture that might have been mistaken for warmth. But he also did not send her away. "My aunt believes you are a fortune hunter." "Your aunt," Elowen said, "believes what is convenient to believe." "And what are you, actually?" She considered the question, the weight of it, the genuine curiosity buried beneath the careful phrasing. Her toes had gone numb. Her fingers ached where they gripped her own arms. "Tired," she said finally. "I am very, very tired of being a problem that other people must solve." Something shifted in his expression. Not a softening, exactly. He was not a man built for softening, but a recognition. A crack in the wall he had constructed so deliberately around himself. He looked at her for a long moment, this woman in her summer wrapper with frost on the hem, standing barefoot in his garden at midnight. Then he looked back at the bench, at his brother's name carved into stone. "I ruin things," he said. "People, everything I—" He stopped, started again. "You should know that, before you decide whether this decree is worth fighting for." Elowen's heart thudded once, hard against her ribs. "I have spent 3 years," she said slowly, "being told what I am worth by people who never troubled to ask what I wanted. I am not interested in being told again." He turned to face her fully. The moonlight caught his jaw, the strong line of it, the tension she was learning to read like text. "What do you want, Miss Sterling?" It was the first time he had asked her anything that mattered. She did not have an answer, not yet, but standing in that frozen garden, looking into eyes that held grief and guilt and something else she could not name, she understood that she would need to find one, and that when she did, she would have to mean it. I need to point out that this chapter had very few of the issues listed in the revision notes. The original was already well written and compliant with the style rules. My revisions were minimal. 1. Changed grey and diminished to diminished and apologetic. Removed the flagged grey descriptor, E2. Changed his particular form of armour to something other than arrogance. Eliminated one instance of overused particular, 3. Changed built so carefully to constructed so deliberately. Varied the language slightly. The chapter already shows rather than tells emotions throughout, uses physical manifestations, frozen feet, misting breath, aching fingers, engages multiple senses, cold, moonlight, silence, contains no explicit content, maintains appropriate word count, follows all narrative style rules. The issues listed in the revision notes primarily concerned chapters 1-2, not chapter 5. This chapter was already strong and required only minor word substitutions. 2 days remained. Elowen learned this from the angle of light through her chamber's eastern windows, from the quality of Tuesday pressing against the glass like an unwanted creditor. Monday would arrive, whether she wished it or not, whether he wished it or not. She had not seen Gideon since the garden. Mrs. Pemberton delivered her meals on trays with apologetic murmurs about His Grace being occupied with urgent correspondence. Lady Philippa had departed at first light, her black lacquered carriage rolling down the drive before Elowen had finished dressing, leaving behind only a faint impression of stiff disapproval and expensive perfume. The house felt larger without her, emptier. Elowen took her breakfast at the small writing desk by the window, though she could not have said afterward what she had eaten. Her third cup of tea had gone cold when the knock came, sharp, unhesitating, the knock of someone who did not expect to be refused entry. She rose, smoothed her grey wool, opened the door herself, because there was no one else to do it. Gideon filled the doorframe. He wore black today. Severe lines, no softness anywhere. His cravat was tied with mathematical precision, his jaw freshly shaved, his bearing that of a man who had armored himself for battle. But his eyes, those winter sky eyes she had watched thaw by moonlight, had frozen over again. Worse than frozen. Resolute. Miss Sterling. Formal. Distant. As if they had not stood together in his garden while he bled secrets into the dark. "I require a moment of your time." She stepped back. He did not enter. "In the library," he said. "If you would." Not a request, an instruction. She followed him through corridors she had memorized, past the small parlor with its dried lavender, past the music room with its shrouded pianoforte. His shoulders stayed rigid ahead of her, braced, carrying some invisible weight she could not name. The library's tall windows let in morning light the color of old pewter, the kind that flattered nothing. His architectural drawings had been cleared from the large table. In their place sat a leather folio, a pen, an inkwell. Papers. Official papers. Her stomach dropped. "I have drafted correspondence to the Crown's representative." He moved to stand behind the table, keeping it between them like a barricade. "Informing him that I intend to forfeit the lease renewals rather than proceed with the marriage." The words landed like stones in still water. Elowen felt their ripples spreading outward through her chest, her throat, settling behind her eyes with a pressure she refused to acknowledge. "The tenants will be provided for through alternative arrangements. I have begun negotiations to purchase the affected lands outright. It will cost significantly more than the preferential terms, and it will take years to recover the expenditure, but it can be done." His chin lifted. "I will not see 14 families displaced because I failed to find another solution." She should have felt relief. She had never wanted this. The decree, the arrangement, the weight of someone else's obligation pressed against her like a brand. She should have thanked him for his consideration, gathered her single trunk, and returned to whatever cousin would take her next. Instead, she heard herself say, "Why?" A muscle shifted in his throat, the only movement in an otherwise marble stillness. "Because you deserve a husband who is not already a ruin." The words came out flat, rehearsed, worn smooth as if he had repeated them to himself until they lost all their edges. "Because I have spent 13 years destroying everything I permit myself to—" He stopped, drew a breath through his teeth. "You saw, in the garden, you saw what I am. I saw a man who has never forgiven himself for being 22. I saw a woman who deserves better than a man who cannot offer her—" Again that abrupt halt. His hands, flat on the table, pressed harder, the knuckles whitening. "The decree absolves you of any obligation to remain. I will arrange transportation to whichever relation will receive you, along with a settlement sufficient to ensure you are not dependent on their charity. It is the least I can do, given the inconvenience you have suffered." Inconvenience. The word struck her like a slap. She moved without deciding to move, circling the table until she stood close enough to see the fine lines of sleeplessness around his eyes, the careful blankness he wore like armor. He did not retreat, but his jaw tightened, and his breath came shorter, and she understood with sudden terrible clarity that this was not rejection, this was protection. He was protecting her from himself. "I will decide what I deserve." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "You do not get to make that determination for me. You do not get to look at me and see only another thing you might ruin, and then congratulate yourself for your noble restraint in walking away." "Miss Sterling." "Elowen." She threw the name at him like a challenge. You held me in confidence beneath your brother's memorial, and you will not call me Miss Sterling while you attempt to dismiss me for my own good." His composure cracked, just a fracture, a flash of something raw and desperate behind the ice. "I am trying to do the right thing." "No." She held his gaze, refusing to be the first to look away, refusing to make this easy. "You are trying to do the safe thing, the thing that allows you to remain exactly as you are, alone, guilty, convinced that anyone who comes close will be destroyed by proximity. But I am not your brother. I am not a dare you issued in recklessness. I am standing here, choosing to stand here. And you do not get to decide that my choice does not count, because you have already convinced yourself you are unworthy of it." He flinched, actually flinched, as if she had struck him. "You do not know what you are asking. Then tell me." She stepped closer, close enough to see his pulse jumping at his throat, to catch the scent of ink and leather, and something underneath that was simply him. Wool warmed by skin, the faint ghost of the garden's frost still clinging to his coat. "Tell me what I'm asking. Tell me what it would cost you to let someone stay." For one suspended heartbeat, she thought he might. His lips parted, his weight shifted forward almost imperceptibly, as if his body had begun answering before his mind could intervene. Then his expression shuttered, his shoulders squared. He stepped back, putting the width of the table between them again, and when he spoke, his voice had gone cold in a way she had not heard since her first morning in his study. "Your carriage will be ready at noon. Mrs. Pemberton will assist with your trunk." He walked out without looking back. Elowen stood alone in the library, surrounded by empty shelves and cleared tables, and the ghost of everything he refused to let himself want. The leather folio sat unsigned on the table. The pen lay where he had left it, pointing toward the door like an accusation. She did not cry. She had 2 days left, and she was not finished. The trunk stood by the door, latched and waiting. Elowen had packed it herself in the grey light before dawn, folding each garment with the same methodical care she had used 3 years ago and 3 years before that, and every time she had been required to make herself small enough to fit into someone else's charity. The blue muslin went first, wrapped in tissue she had saved from its original purchase. The dove grey wool followed. Her mother's pearl earrings, the only jewellery that remained after her father's creditors had finished, she tucked into a handkerchief and pressed into the corner where they would not shift during travel. She had requested the hired coach for 9 o'clock. Mrs. Pemberton had received the request with pressed lips and a single nod, the kind of acknowledgement that said everything while committing to nothing. Now she stood at the window of her sitting room, watching the morning mist lift from the eastern lawns in slow, reluctant ribbons, and tried to feel relieved. This was, after all, what she had prepared for. Not the marriage. She had never truly believed the marriage would happen, not in the way she might once have believed in fairy stories or her father's promises. She had prepared for the leaving, for the moment when she would gather her single trunk and her bruised dignity and walk out of another house that had never been hers. The settlement Gideon had mentioned would change things. She would not return to Lord Ashworth's sufferance. She would have rooms of her own somewhere, modest but sufficient, walls she could touch, a door she could close. It should have felt like victory. Her fingers found the window latch, traced its cold brass edge. Outside, a blackbird called twice and fell silent. The knock came at 7 minutes past 8. She knew it was not Mrs. Pemberton. Mrs. Pemberton knocked twice, crisp and efficient. This was a single knock followed by silence, as though the person on the other side was reconsidering the wisdom of the action. Elowen crossed the room, opened the door. Gideon stood in the corridor, and he was not wearing black. The coat was deep green, the colour of forests in late summer, cut close across shoulders that had lost their rigid military set. His cravat was tied with less than his usual precision, the knot slightly off-centre, as though he had done it himself without the aid of a glass. In his hands he held a folio of papers bound with leather cord. "You are awake," he said. "I am leaving." "Yes." His gaze moved past her to the trunk by the door. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a muscle flickering once near his ear. "I am aware." "Then you will understand that I have very little time for... I need you to look at something." Elowen had spent 3 years learning to read the silences between words. She had learned to hear the dismissal beneath courtesy, the impatience beneath politeness, the unspoken wish that she would simply disappear. This was not that language. "I am not going to propose to you," Gideon said, and the words came out rougher than she had ever heard him speak, scraped raw, as though he had dragged them up from somewhere he kept locked. "I am not going to deliver a speech about my feelings, because I have spent 13 years ensuring I do not have feelings, and I refuse to begin examining them in a corridor at 8 o'clock in the morning." "Then what?" He held out the folio. She took it. The leather was warm from his hands, worn soft at the edges from handling. She untied the cord and opened it, and for a moment she did not understand what she was seeing. Architectural drawings, but not the tenant cottages she had seen in the library. These were different, smaller, a single structure drawn from multiple angles with the same careful notations she had observed before. Southeast exposure for morning light, window seat, dimensions to accommodate reading, bookshelves, floor to ceiling, eastern wall. "The Dower House," Gideon said. "It has stood empty for 9 years. The roof needs repair, and the chimneys require repointing, and my mother stripped most of the furnishings when she departed for Bath." Eloin turned the page, a floor plan annotated in his hand. "Study, private, adjacent to garden access. I have instructed my solicitor to transfer the property into your name, not as part of a marriage settlement, not as charity, as a gift unencumbered with a maintenance income attached that does not depend on my continued existence or goodwill." She looked up. He was watching her with something between defiance and dread. His weight shifted forward onto the balls of his feet, as though preparing for a blow he fully expected to land. "You redesigned it," she said. "Yes. For me. You said you wanted walls you could touch and know were yours." His voice dropped, barely above a murmur. "A door you could close against the world." I was listening. The folio shook in her grip. She pressed her fingers harder against the leather to still them. "The king's decree expires at midnight, I am aware." He drew a breath that seemed to cost him something, his chest expanding slowly, deliberately. "This is not about the decree. This is not about the leases or the tenants or my aunt's opinions, or any of the dozen excellent reasons I should have sent you away the morning you appeared uninvited in my study." "Then what is it about?" The silence stretched between them, fragile as frost on glass. "I need to know," Gideon said, and his voice fractured on the words, breaking apart like ice in spring thaw, "whether you would have chosen me. If there had been no decree, no obligation, no leverage. If you had simply been a woman and I had simply been a man."
Stood in the doorway of everything lost, with nothing but silence to hold. A name that was broken, a past that it cost more than the stories they told. I built all my walls out of guilt and regret, stone after stone. I stayed alone, but you walked inside where I never let anyone call it home. You didn't ask me to be whole. You only stayed and saw my soul. I was a ruin, cold and alone, a house with no light in the halls. But you saw a fire I never had known, and refused to let me fall. Now every shadow is breaking apart, every silence you wrote. I was a ruin, but you made me a home. 7 days standing on borrowed time, two hearts with nothing to lose. You spoke your truth like a quiet crime and gave me something to choose. I feared every touch, every breath, every name, believing I only destroy. But you stood your ground in the pouring rain and called me more than my void. You never needed me to change. You only asked me not to run away. I was a ruin, cold and alone, a ghost in a house made of stone. But you found the place I buried my heart and said I was not alone. Now every scar feels less like a war, every fear overthrown. I was a ruin, but you made me a home. If I lose you, I lose everything, more than I ever confessed. But you held my hand in the dark of it all and taught me how to rest. I was a ruin, broken and torn, a man who was meant to be alone. But you chose to stay through the worst of the storm and turn my fear into home. Now I will build every wall again, but this time you won't be gone. I was a ruin, now I'm finally home. You didn't save me, you stayed